All right, welcome to Decrypting the Law, your source for legal insights about the tokenized future. I'm Jason Somensatto. I am the Strategic Legal Counsel on the Zero X Core team. Before we get started, a quick disclaimer. I am a lawyer, but I am not your lawyer, so don't take anything I'm saying here as legal advice. If you need advice on a project, hopefully a Zero X project, hire your own lawyer. I can help you out with that if you need some help. Topic for today, we are going to discuss the SEC, a very hot topic in the crypto industry. I know there's been a lot of discussion about the Howey test, but what I want to go through is kind of just understanding the actual organization of the SEC a little bit better and what their interest in the cryptocurrency industry is. So I'll talk about a few of those topics. We'll finish off with a few user questions from the Zero X community. And in the future, if you have questions, send them to me. Send them to Brent Oshiro, our community lead, and we will try to answer them on future episodes. All right, so what is the SEC? It is an agency of the U.S. government that is charged with enforcing the securities laws. So I think an important concept to understand is that the SEC's jurisdiction extends as far as the securities industry itself extends. Now, not all investments are securities investments. There's a lot of things that we invest in as individuals that aren't necessarily securities. Real estate, artwork, education, all of those things are not securities, and so they are not regulated by the SEC. But the SEC does have jurisdiction over everything that falls within the securities markets. And the SEC is made up of, at its top level, 5 commissioners. So right now there are actually only 4 commissioners at the SEC. They're waiting to approve a 5th one. But these individuals are basically charged with making the important decisions about what the SEC does. So for example, whether or not the SEC is going to approve a Bitcoin ETF comes down to a vote of these individuals. Whether or not the SEC is going to bring a lawsuit against Kick for an unregistered securities offering comes down to the vote of these people. Obviously, these aren't the people, though, who are doing the day-to-day work at the SEC. Instead, that falls to what we call the staff of the SEC. The staff of the SEC is made up of about 4,000 lawyers, accountants, and other professionals with some level of expertise in the securities markets. And their responsibilities range from everything to reviewing public company filings to writing new rules that'll apply to the securities industry. However, the vast majority of people who work at the SEC work in what is considered the enforcement arm of the SEC. Those people are charged with identifying violations of the securities laws and bringing enforcement actions against those people that they have alleged violations. So, for us lawyers who work in the industry, we tend to think about the SEC as primarily an enforcement agency. So why does the SEC care about cryptocurrencies? There's a lot of reasons, but I think it comes down to 2 really important concepts. One is that, and I think this is something that the industry itself shouldn't be afraid to admit, that the primary use of cryptocurrencies and tokens right now is as an investment vehicle. And the reason I don't think we need to be afraid of that concept is because, as I've said before, not all investments are securities investments, but obviously the investment market overlaps in some ways with the securities market, and that's where the SEC's role comes in. I think, to be even more specific, why does the SEC care about the crypto industry? It comes down to ICOs. 2017 saw a period of a lot of teams and projects and companies raising money through token sales. And the SEC is still now struggling with kind of what is the reach of their jurisdiction as it relates to these token sales. And I think there's varying level of opinions, and you'll hear a lot of lawyers argue about where that line is drawn. But the SEC sees it as part of its mantra or part of its mission to protect retail investors from bad investments. And so obviously when there is a boom in a new area of investment, they're going to take a close look and decide what the extent of their jurisdiction in that area is. So another question might be, like, who are these people working at the SEC who matter in the crypto world? Like, who should I be listening to? Who has strong opinions on this? I think you have to start at the top. We go back to the chairman of the SEC, Jay Clayton. He's responsible for setting the agenda of kind of which areas of the securities market the SEC is going to focus on. And it's kind of his decision that one of the areas be the cryptocurrency market. And what I've heard, I don't have any personal experience, is I've heard he's fairly skeptical about the industry. And so that opinion plays kind of an outsized role in how the SEC might look at the industry. Conversely, Commissioner Hester Peirce, who people refer to as Crypto Mom, is somebody who's been a very vocal supporter of the industry. I think probably like a lot of us here, sees some of the promise in the technology and is hoping to see a path by which people can develop this in a way without kind of constantly being worried about the regulators. But those are kind of two competing forces in some ways at the top of the SEC. But I think it's important to highlight a few other people. Most specifically, the SEC now has an organization inside of the staff that is focused almost entirely on the blockchain technology space. So this organization called FinHub is set up to kind of be the first people to be educated about the technology, to advise other parts of the SEC about the technology, and to meet with representatives of the industry about what they're building. And the FinHub is led by this woman named Valerie Stepanek, who I have met on a few different occasions and have heard speak at several public events, and I find to be incredibly insightful and thoughtful and well educated on the technology. And so I think ultimately that's a pretty positive sign to have somebody like that leading the efforts within the SEC. But obviously she's just one person. And going back to what I was saying about the SEC being primarily an enforcement agency, the kind of output of what the SEC is doing as it relates to this industry primarily comes in the form of the many enforcement actions you see listed on this webpage right here, which are several different token offerings and token businesses and promoters of token projects, for which the SEC has alleged that those individuals were promoting or trading or fundraising through a securities offering. And all of these are settlements where the private party settled with the SEC. But despite kind of whoever might be a supporter within the industry or within the SEC, this is kind of the output that you see from the SEC. But I think it's important to note that the SEC is kind of not the final say on what is ultimately a security and what is a violation of the securities law. All they do is have the ability to bring a lawsuit against somebody who they allege to have done wrong. In the US system, it falls to the courts to make that decision. Another topic that gets kind of raised a lot is whether or not to engage with the SEC. You want to build a project. Hopefully you want to build something on top of 0x. And this one is complicated. I think people have a variety of different views on this. What I'll say in this debate is, if you're planning to build something that you think will fall outside of the SEC's jurisdiction because it ultimately won't involve securities, it is probably better to talk to a lawyer and to get an opinion or analysis on the risk of taking that route, because the SEC is just not in the business of meeting with somebody and telling them, no, what you're going to do doesn't implicate our laws. That's just not the way it works. They're not there to greenlight that they don't have a say over what you're building. On the flip side, if you are building something that you think is directly going to implicate the securities laws, let's say you want to build a relayer that supports tokenized securities, in which case you're probably going to need to be registered with the SEC in some capacity. And in that environment, the SEC is going to want to know what you're building, how you're utilizing the technology. And so in that situation, it's different facts and circumstances. And yes, it's going to be necessary to go proactively talk to the SEC. The other way that people end up talking to the SEC is ultimately being responsive to subpoenas that they receive or other requests for information. And the only thing I'll say about that is, again, remember, this is a law enforcement agency. And so that is, law enforcement requesting information for you. And you want to take that very seriously and probably have a lawyer involved and be careful about how you interact with the SEC on that front. I think that's pretty much covers some of the basics about the SEC. To sum up kind of some of the points I was making, I put this together. So key takeaway number one, the SEC regulates securities, but not all investments are securities investments. Number two, the line between what is and is not a security it's not that clear, and the SEC does not get the final say in where to draw that line. Three, the SEC is primarily an enforcement agency. Number four, although the SEC is very knowledgeable and has some people who are pretty supportive and knowledgeable within the organization, ultimately its regulation is much more based on how tokens are marketed and sold to investors and less about actually how the technology works. And then, kind of importantly, the SEC is not going to tell you prospectively that what you want to build doesn't implicate the security laws. So it's really important to have a good education and kind of make the good faith analysis. Say you want to put together a 0x layer and you don't want to touch securities. Well, you're going to need to have some system in place to make that analysis, whether it's looking at what other reputable projects are doing, having a lawyer on staff to do some of that, or some other means of making good faith analysis. I tend to think, and if we flip over to kind of the questions that I think we have from some 0x community members, we can talk about this a little bit more. So yes, Jenny76. Obviously, I am biased, but I think there is a path forward for 0x relayers. I think from the SEC's perspective, this all depends on what kind of marketplace you're making available to users. And right now, without a lot of court cases that provide a precedent for where this line is going to be drawn as to what assets kind of fall within the SEC's jurisdiction, we can kind of see this on a spectrum. On one end, there might be, NFTs and video game items and crypto collectibles, and on the other end is, real tokenized securities that we know to fall within the SEC's ambit. And so the path there is, to understand how the risk varies along that spectrum. And if the goal again is to build a relay or a marketplace that's not implicating the securities laws, then you got to make sure that what you're offering up to the users of your site are not securities. Next question, Crypto Carl. All right. Oh yes, Crypto Carl. Hey, listen, I am the first one who can be critical of the SEC. I have been critical in private conversations about some of their enforcement actions and some of the reasoning behind it. But ultimately, I think I'm pretty sympathetic to the position that the regulators are in this industry. It's really hard to predict what's going to happen with this technology, what it's going to be used for. And ultimately, they're applying a kind of principled test that doesn't have a lot of precedent setting in this industry. And so I find myself to be one of the people who's not really pounding the table asking for the SEC to provide more clarity and guidance. Personally, I'd rather see a little bit more deferment and allowing the space to develop, and hopefully ideas like this and other lawyers kind of getting out there and helping the industry understand kind of a responsible way of building, rather than letting the regulators define this. But I'm hopeful. All right. With that said, if you guys found this interesting, if you want more content on this, you can go to, there is a wiki available that I've prepared. If you go to the 0x website under resources, you can go to the 0x legal wiki, where there's more information about some of the SEC's laws, but also other laws like AML and OFAC sanctions. And I've also put together a library of resources that identify a lot of the cases and important statements from the SEC. So go check those out. Tell me if there's information you'd like to see that isn't there. If you're a lawyer and you want to contribute to this, definitely get in touch with me. It would be great. All right, I hope you liked that video. If you did, definitely subscribe to our YouTube channel, leave a comment, and I've watched my kids' YouTube videos enough, so smash that like button. But until next time, keep it decentralized.